I'm Marjorie Ellis, 76 years old, and for the first time in decades, I woke up to the sharp crack of broken china. Not my own, but a sound that cut straight through the early silence. My daughter-in-law Peyton's voice carried from the kitchen, a warning not to step on the glass as if I hadn't known how to walk my own halls. Garrett was upstairs lacing his sneakers for his morning run, the children still tangled in their sheets, and I stood in my robe in the doorway, just a shadow in the house I once called home. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever felt out of place in your own family. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky, raised by parents who valued decency above all else. My mother taught me to mend what was torn. My father believed in quiet hard work and honest hands. We never had much beyond what we needed, but we never went without warmth or love. I married Eugene Ellis when I was 24, and we bought this house together in Mountain Brook when we finally had the savings, the front porch with the swing, the soft magnolia trees, the kitchen that always smelled of bread on Sundays. It all felt like a promise. The years passed, we raised our son Garrett, and even after Eugene's heart gave out 15 years ago, I kept this place clean as best I could, though the stairs grew steeper every year. 5 years back, Garrett and Peyton convinced me to sign the house over to Garrett to avoid complications down the road. That's what they said. I wanted to help. I didn't think it would change anything, but it did. Peyton moved in her own furniture. The curtains went out to the curb. My old blue armchair was boxed up for goodwill, and little by little, my life seemed to fade. Behind new chrome and glass every morning became a list of small chores. I'd wake Hugo and Allie for school, make sure Peyton's yogurt was on the top shelf, run errands that stretched from one side of town to the other. The neighborhood grocery where Eugene and I used to buy summer peaches was a dollar store. Now, the organic shop where Peyton sent me for specialty flour played music so soft, I felt invisible, standing there clutching her long list sometimes on the bus ride home. My arms would ache from the weight of the bags. I'd sit by the window, watching other women hurry past with purpose, wondering when I'd started to feel like a guest in my own town. The kitchen was always Peyton's domain. Now, she counted calories for the children and for herself, made everything clean and precise. Even Sunday mornings were hurried oatmeal protein shakes. No pancakes anymore. Not like the old days. Garrett always seemed tired, lost behind a newspaper or his phone, the children polite and busy with lessons. One evening, I tried to help with plans for their anniversary. Garrett and Peyton were talking about venues and caterers, 50 people for a small party. I offered to make invitations by hand, something I'd done for every birthday when Garrett was little, but Peyton only smiled politely and told me the party needed to be elegant and modern. Her words left me cold. I kept quiet. I told myself it was easier that way. Later that week, when I overheard Peyton complaining that I was meddling, stuck in old-fashioned ways, I crept up the stairs and sat quietly in my room. The small guest bedroom I'd made my own. I pulled down the old photo album and ran my hands over the pictures. The house was quiet now, but I could still hear their voices from downstairs. It struck me that my memories seemed to belong to another life, one that didn't fit in this new world. And as I turned another page in that album, the picture of Eugene holding Garrett as a boy. I wondered when my place in this house had become so uncertain. The anniversary was coming soon, and for the first time, I felt a hush settle inside me, not just of old age, but of being truly unseen. The morning of the photo shoot arrived warmer than I'd expected for late September. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands folded in my lap, listening to the house wake up around me. Peyton was already in the kitchen giving instructions, her voice clear and clipped as she directed the children to finish their breakfast and not spill anything on their outfits. I had spent extra time that morning getting ready, smoothing down the navy dress they'd chosen for me, pinning my hair the way Peyton liked best. and even adding a touch of powder and lipstick that felt a little unfamiliar now. The house smelled faintly of coffee and oatmeal, and for a moment I paused at the top of the stairs, listening to the quiet rhythm of spoons against bowls, the hum of Garrett's voice as he reminded Hugo to tuck in his shirt, Allie adjusting the bow at the waist of her dress. Garrett's eyes met mine when I entered the kitchen. "You look nice, Mom," he said, sounding almost surprised. Hugo grinned and called out, "Grandma, you look like you're going to a wedding." Peyton glanced at me, her gaze flickering up and down. "We should leave soon," she said. "The photographer's waiting at the park, and I want the children to look presentable." The air felt heavy with expectation as we all gathered our things. Garrett took the car with Peyton and the kids, leaving me to catch the bus so I wouldn't be in the way during the first round of pictures. I didn't mind the ride. I sat near the window, watching the familiar streets go by the late summer sunlight, falling through the branches of the old sycamores houses, set back from the road front lawns scattered with fallen leaves. When I arrived at Riverview Park, I found the family already assembled on a footbridge over the pond, the photographer arranging them with careful hands. Peyton and Garrett looked the part of a picture-perfect couple, their outfits coordinated, the children neat and silent at their sides. I hung back a little, not wanting to intrude. The photographer, a young woman with sharp eyes and a patient voice, spotted me and called out, "You must be Beverly. Ready for your close-up?" She smiled kindly, but I could see the confusion in her eyes as Peyton pulled her aside, whispering in hushed tones. "The main photos would be just the four of them for now," she said. "But she'd be sure to include me soon." I watched as they posed beneath the willow tree, Garrett, with his arm around Peyton's waist, Hugo and Allie each holding one of her hands. Their faces arranged in careful smiles, heads tilted, shoulders straight. The photographer moved them this way and that, searching for the perfect angle. Finally, it was my turn to join. "Grandma, come stand next to Daddy," Hugo called, his voice bright and clear. I stepped in, heart pounding a little faster. The photographer arranged us beneath the old oak tree, the late morning sun warm on my back. "Everybody look this way," she said, "and smile." I did my best, trying to settle the nerves in my hands, wishing I didn't feel so exposed. We moved on to a stone bench for the next set. Peyton sat beside Garrett, the children on either end, and I was asked to stand behind. I squinted in the bright light, unsure where to look. "Beverly, could you step to the left a bit?" the photographer asked gently, "just so the sun isn't in your eyes." I took a half step, adjusting my stance. Peyton frowned, glancing at my dress, then at my shoes. I caught her eye and quickly looked away. It was when we reached the pond that things unraveled. I tried to step carefully along the bank, but my foot caught on a patch of damp earth, and before I knew it, the hem of my dress had dipped into the water. I steadied myself with a hand on a willow branch, but it snapped with a quiet crack, leaving me off balance, my dress wet and wrinkled. Peyton's face tightened. "Please be careful," she whispered sharply. "These gardens are expensive to maintain." The photographer moved us on, offering a quiet word of reassurance, but Peyton's mood had changed. Each time I joined the group, she would murmur suggestions for a different arrangement. "Let's have a few of the children with Grandma, maybe just the three of you on the bench. Garrett and I can be in the next set." For the next half hour, I posed with Hugo and Allie by the flowers, by the little bridge, by the iron gate at the edge of the garden. The children didn't seem to notice anything was amiss. Hugo held my hand and pointed out a dragonfly hovering near the reeds. Allie straightened my necklace for one of the pictures, but every time I glanced back at the others, Peyton's face was pinched. Garrett's eyes fixed on the ground. When the main shoot resumed, Peyton told me to rest on the bench and keep the children company. I did as she asked, folding my hands in my lap, watching her and Garrett pose together as if nothing had happened. It was then that Allie leaned close, her small hand slipping into mine. "Grandma," she asked in a quiet voice, "why is Mom mad at you?" I smoothed her hair, not sure what to say. She's just tired, I managed. It's a long day for everyone. Hugo pressed against my side, ice cream cone melting in his hand, chattering about the ducks he'd seen on the water. I listened, smiling when I could. But my mind felt far away, adrift in a feeling I couldn't quite name. A few minutes later, Peyton returned, her voice tight. We're going to do a few more of just us and the kids. Beverly, could you wait here? We'll be finished soon. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the children as they trotted off to join their parents for another round of photos. I watched from the bench as they moved together, a little unit arranged in every possible combination, except the one that included me. When it was finally over, Peyton approached, her face carefully composed. Thank you for understanding, she said quietly. These photos mean a lot to us. Garrett trailed behind, hands in his pockets, not meeting my eyes. Hugo ran up to hug me, whispering that he wished I could come home with them. I promised I'd see him soon. On the bus ride back, the window glass was cool against my forehead. I watched the afternoon drift by, outside streets moving past in a blur of sunlight and long shadows. I thought about the family I'd built with Eugene, the old photo albums packed away in the guest room, the house that no longer looked or sounded or felt like the place where I'd raised my son. By the time I stepped off the bus, the ache in my chest had settled into something quiet and deep. When I walked through the front door, the house was empty. I set my purse on the table, hung up my cardigan, and went upstairs to change out of the ruined dress. I rinsed the hem in the sink, watching the water turn cloudy, the fabric heavy in my hands. Downstairs, the silence stretched around me, as wide and cold as a winter field. As I stood at the kitchen window, the first notes of the coming evening drifting in from the street, I understood that things would not return to the way they had been. There was no place for me in the photographs or in the family that gathered without me. Still, there was dinner to make and laundry to fold. I moved through the routines of the day, letting them anchor me to the world I still knew. Even as something inside me began to shift, quiet and certain, toward whatever would come next. I moved through the house quietly, collecting plates from the dinner table and stacking them in the sink, listening to the muffled voices drifting from the living room. Garrett was on a conference call, pacing near the window. His words clipped and hurried. Peyton had retreated to her home office, the click of her keyboard carrying down the hallway. The children's laughter echoed upstairs, Hugo's footsteps racing across the landing as he called for Allie to help with a science project. I rinsed the dishes, my hands working by memory, and paused for a moment, watching the suds swirl down the drain. The house felt empty, even with everyone inside. After dinner, I made my way upstairs to fold laundry. The basket was heavier than usual, shirts and socks mixed with the children's uniforms, a few of my old cardigans tossed in on top. I sat on the edge of the bed in the small guest room, folding each piece of clothing with slow, careful movements. The walls were lined with old photographs, Eugene smiling in front of the late Garrett on his first bicycle, Allie's kindergarten picture with her 2 missing teeth. I let my fingers rest on the frames, remembering how different the house had felt back then. The sounds and smells and light all mixed together. Now even the air seemed changed, thin and distant, as if the place belonged to someone else. The next morning started before sunrise. I woke to the sound of the trash truck rumbling down the street, then Peyton's voice from the kitchen asking if I'd seen the special granola she'd bought. Hugo and Allie wandered in, rubbing their eyes, asking what was for breakfast. I served them toast and orange juice, watched them gather up their backpacks, and waved as they hurried out the door with Garrett late again for the school bus. The house grew quiet once more. I set about my usual chores, dusting the mantel, watering the plants, writing out the grocery list Peyton had sent to my phone. That afternoon, the silence grew heavy. I took the bus across town for errands, Peyton's vitamins, a loaf of the rye bread. She preferred a special kind of yogurt for Hugo's sensitive stomach. The clerk at the drugstore handed me the bag without a word, already turning away before I could thank him. On the way home, my arms ached from the weight of the groceries, and I stopped to rest on the bench near the old library. I watched the cars pass people walking by with quick steps lost in their own thoughts. I arrived home later than planned. The sunlight was fading, the house cast in long, soft shadows. Peyton looked up from her laptop as I walked in, her mouth tightening when she saw the time. "You're late," she said. "Hugo has already finished his practice." I explained that the bus was delayed, that the pharmacy had taken longer than usual, but she only nodded and turned back to her screen. I set the groceries on the counter, put away the bread and yogurt, filled the glass jar with vitamins. Dinner that night was quiet. Garrett talked about a new policy at work. Peyton discussed the anniversary party. The children bickered softly over whose turn it was to feed the dog. I listened, answering when spoken to, filling the spaces between their voices. After the meal, I cleared the plates, wiped down the counters, and swept the kitchen floor. I could hear the television from the living room, a sitcom laugh track rising and falling in the background. Later, as I settled into my room, there was a soft knock at the door. Hugo poked his head inside, holding the old photo album we'd looked at together a few nights before. "Grandma, will you tell me about this picture?" he asked, climbing up beside me on the bed. I traced the faces in the photograph, Eugene Young and strong Garrett as a toddler on his father's shoulders. Hugo listened quietly, his head against my arm, asking questions about the people in each image. "Were you happy back then?" he asked suddenly. I smiled, smoothing his hair, and told him I was. "Do you like living with us?" His voice was small and hopeful. I hesitated, choosing my words with care, and told him that I loved spending time with him, that families always change and grow. Peyton's voice from the hallway broke the moment. "Hugo, it's bedtime. Let your grandmother rest." He gave me a quick hug and hurried out, leaving the album in my lap. I sat for a long time after he left, turning the pages, listening to the house settle into night. Days passed in much the same way. Peyton and Garrett grew busier with each detail of the party, debating menus and guest lists late into the evening. I offered to help, suggesting a dish from my old recipe book or handmade decorations, but my ideas were politely brushed aside. Peyton preferred to keep things modern and simple. The invitations arrived thick and silver-edged, arranged in neat stacks on the dining room table. I admired their elegance, running my hand over the raised print, but Peyton quickly gathered them up and set them aside. Her voice clipped as she thanked me for understanding. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Garrett and Peyton as they sat in the living room speaking in hushed voices. "She means well, but it's hard sometimes," Peyton said. "I just want everything to be perfect, and she keeps bringing up old-fashioned ideas." Garrett's reply was quiet, barely above a whisper. I turned away, not wanting to intrude, returning to the kitchen to finish folding napkins. As the day of the anniversary drew near, I found myself growing more withdrawn. The children kept to their routines, busy with school and practice. Peyton grew more tense, her temper sharper, Garrett more distant. I kept to my chores and quiet corners, moving through the days as gently as I could, careful not to get in the way. At night, I would sit by the window, watching the streetlights come on one by one, the neighborhood settling into stillness. The morning of the party, I woke early, the house still dark. I dressed in the outfit Peyton had chosen for me, a soft blue dress, simple jewelry, and went down to the kitchen to start coffee. The children came, in their hair freshly brushed, chattering about the excitement of the big day. Garrett and Peyton appeared soon after, giving instructions for last-minute preparations. "Beverly, can you set out the appetizers when the caterer arrives?" Peyton asked, "and make sure the kids are dressed and ready before the photographer gets here." I nodded, moving from task to task, careful to do exactly as I was told. As the guests began to arrive, I stepped back, watching from the hallway as the house filled with laughter and voices. The photographer moved through the crowd, arranging family and friends for photos, calling out instructions with practiced ease. Peyton and Garrett posed together in front of the fireplace, the children at their sides. I stood quietly near the staircase, waiting to be called in for my turn. When it came time for the official family portraits, Peyton called me over her smile tight. "We'll take a few with the whole group," she said, "but then we need some of just us for the announcement board." I nodded, taking my place beside Garrett, the children in front. The photographer snapped a few quick photos, then gestured for me to step aside as Peyton guided the others in closer for the next round of shots. The party wore on, guests laughing and talking, music playing softly in the background. I made my way through the rooms, greeting old friends, offering slices of cake, answering questions about the children and the house. Everywhere I went, I felt the same gentle distance, welcomed, but not truly part of the celebration. As the evening wound down, I gathered plates from the tables washed up in the kitchen and slipped upstairs before the last guests had left. I closed my bedroom door, the quiet settling in once again. The house was filled with laughter and light, but all I could hear was the steady tick of the clock on the nightstand, marking out the hours until morning. Lying there, I listened to the muffled sounds of the family below Garrett, thanking the guests, Peyton laughing with her friends Hugo and Allie giggling as they were sent off to bed. I closed my eyes and let the darkness fill the room, waiting for sleep to come. Morning would bring more chores, more routines, but something had changed, a quiet shift beneath the surface. I didn't know yet what it would mean, only that the days ahead would not be as they had always been. The days after the anniversary party slipped by in a quiet blur. The house was still, the children gone to school, Garrett off to work before sunrise, and Peyton moving briskly from one task to the next. I carried on with my usual chores, laundry folded in careful stacks, beds made smooth, and neat groceries tucked away on the right shelves. It would have been easy to let the days blend together, to ignore the feeling that something inside me had shifted. But each time I looked at the photographs arranged on the mantel or past the guest room mirror, I felt the weight of that party still clinging to me, reminding me of where I stood in this family. One afternoon, after I finished tidying up the kitchen, I heard the doorbell ring. It was Muriel, our neighbor, standing on the porch with a small plate of blueberry muffins and a gentle smile. "I saw you at the bus stop yesterday," she said softly. "Thought you might like some company." We sat in her kitchen, sunlight spilling through the window, the scent of fresh baking warming the air. She poured tea and asked about the celebration. I found myself speaking more openly than I intended, describing the hours I spent in the background, the awkward pauses, the way Peyton and Garrett kept their conversations just out of reach. Muriel listened without interruption, her hands folded on the table, her eyes kind and steady. When I finished, she didn't offer advice or reassurance. Instead, she told me about the years after her husband passed, how the house had grown too quiet, how she learned to fill the silence with new routines, small joys, and unexpected friendships. We talked until the sun sank low and the shadows stretched across the linoleum. When I got home, the house felt different, less like a place I was merely keeping, and more like a space I needed to consider for myself. That evening, while folding laundry in my room, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, hair brushed back, my old blue cardigan draped over my shoulders, a tiredness behind my eyes that I couldn't quite shake. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window at the darkening sky, thinking of all the years spent caring for others, how easily those years stacked up until I could hardly remember the last time I made a decision just for myself. Eugene's photograph sat on the nightstand, his smile as gentle as ever. I wondered what advice he might give if he could see the way things had changed. The next morning brought a steady rain tapping against the kitchen windows. I was halfway through preparing breakfast when Peyton breezed in, tapping on her phone. Beverly, don't forget Allie has piano at 4. And I need you to stop at the market, there's a list on your phone. She didn't look up as she spoke, already moving on to the next thing. Garrett came in a few minutes later, his suit-pressed eyes tired. He poured coffee, thanked me out of habit, and hurried out the door. Hugo and Allie finished their toast, collected their bags, and ran for the bus. I stood in the kitchen, the quiet pressing in around me. The list on my phone was longer than usual, but I didn't mind the errands. On the bus into town, I watched the rain streak down the glass, the city moving by in blurred grays and greens. I thought about my conversation with Muriel, about the feeling I'd carried home with me, something lighter, steadier, a question taking root in the back of my mind. What would my life look like if I stepped outside the role I'd filled for so long? What might happen if I let myself want something more? Later that afternoon, I found myself back at Muriel's house, umbrella dripping on her porch. She welcomed me in, set a kettle on the stove, and listened as I talked about the routines that shaped my days, the longing for a sense of belonging, the memories of a house that once felt like home. Muriel nodded, her expression gentle. "You deserve to feel seen, Marjorie," she said quietly. "You've given so much. There's nothing selfish about wanting more from your days." Back home, I moved through the motions of evening, setting the table, heating soup, folding towels warm from the dryer. I watched Garrett and Peyton moving through their own routines, their words sometimes clipped, sometimes hurried. The children, full of energy and stories, settled down to homework as I washed dishes, the quiet hum of their voices drifting from the next room. Later, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the familiar sounds of the house, the pipes ticking as they cooled, the distant rumble of a car on the street, the soft shuffle of footsteps overhead. Days passed, each one blending into the next. But inside, something was changing. I found myself waking before dawn, watching the first light creep across the ceiling, wondering what would happen if I claimed a few small pieces of the day for myself. I started taking longer walks in the morning, pausing to admire the gardens or listen to the birds at the edge of the park. Sometimes I stopped for coffee at a cafe near the library, savoring the simple pleasure of sitting by the window with nothing to do but watch the world go by. One afternoon after another, quiet visit with Muriel, I lingered on her porch, looking back at my own house. The yard was neatly trimmed, the porch swept clean, but it no longer felt like the home Eugene and I had built together. For the first time, I let myself imagine living somewhere else, a place that belonged to me, even if it was small and quiet, even if it meant starting over at 76. That night after dinner, I found Garrett in the den reading through some paperwork for the office. I hesitated in the doorway, then sat beside him, folding my hands in my lap. "Garrett," I said, my voice soft, "do you remember how we used to sit on the porch after dinner, just talking? I miss those days." He glanced up, a flicker of something passing over his face. Maybe surprise, maybe regret. He nodded, but his attention quickly slipped back to the pages in his hands. I waited a moment longer, then rose and went upstairs to my room. I sat at my desk, the house quiet around me. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a thin moon hung over the rooftops. I opened the old notebook I used for lists and recipes, and instead of jotting down groceries or appointments, I wrote a question: what do I want for myself? The words looked strange on the page, but I left them there, a small promise to return. As the days passed, I started to pay closer attention to the world outside my routines, the way the morning light warmed the living room, the quiet of the library, the sound of laughter drifting from Muriel's kitchen window. I caught myself smiling more often, finding comfort in simple things. The feeling grew slowly, but it was steady, a gentle reminder that I was still here, still capable of change, still worthy of more. One morning, as I poured coffee and looked out at the dewy lawn, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. The ache of feeling unseen had faded, replaced by something sturdier. The next step wasn't clear yet, but I could feel it waiting just beyond the horizon. And as I moved through the quiet house, I knew that whatever came next would belong to me. In the hush of that morning, I reached for my cup and watched the light climb higher, feeling the certainty build inside me. Soon, it would be time to choose a different path. The morning after my talk with Muriel, I moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake anyone. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the mug, letting the warmth settle into my bones. The house was hushed, except for the tick of the clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. For once, I wasn't making breakfast or packing lunches, just sitting and watching the sun begin to spill through the blinds. I listened to the sounds of the day, starting Garrett's heavy footsteps above Peyton's quick, familiar tread down the hallway, the creak of the bathroom door. Muriel came to the back door just after dawn, as promised. She wore her garden jacket and a gentle expression. "Ready?" she asked, her voice quiet. I nodded, setting my cup in the sink. We walked out together under the pale sky through the damp grass to her little cottage at the edge of her yard. The air was fresh, still cool, with the last hint of night. Inside, her guest house was small but inviting, a simple living room with a tidy kitchen nook, the faint scent of lavender in the air. I looked around at the sunlit space, the shelves lined with books, the clean windows framing the garden. It was nothing grand, but it felt like a place where a person could begin again. I stood in the center of the room, taking in the details: Muriel's favorite armchair, a vase of wildflowers, the quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. "If you decide this is right," she said gently, "it's yours as long as you want it." The words settled over me slowly. For the first time in years, I felt like I was being offered a choice instead of another obligation. I thanked her, my voice steady, and said I needed a little more time to gather my courage to work out what to tell my family. Back in my own house, I went about my routine, but my mind was elsewhere. The decision lingered at the edge of every thought. Later that morning, while Peyton was busy on a work call and the children were at school, I found Garrett in the den, sorting through the mail. "I need to talk to you about something important," I said. He looked up, distracted at first, but when he saw my face, he set the envelopes aside and nodded. I told him I was planning to move out to take Muriel up on her offer. At first, he didn't understand. He tried to laugh it off, but I stayed quiet, holding his gaze until the smile faded from his lips. "You're serious?" he said, his voice suddenly softer. I told him yes, I was, and explained as gently as I could that I needed space, that I wanted to live for myself for however many years I had left. The house felt still after our conversation. I knew Garrett would tell Peyton, and I waited for her response, bracing for the conversation that always followed news she didn't want to hear. That evening, she came into my room, her arms folded. "I don't see why you're making such a fuss," she said. "You know you'll be lonely over there. It's not safe at your age." I kept my voice calm and told her I'd thought about it carefully, that I needed to do this for myself. She pressed on, listing all the inconveniences: who would help with the kids, who would watch the house when they traveled, who would take care of errands when her schedule was too full. I listened, answered simply, and didn't raise my voice. She left with a tight smile, letting the door fall closed behind her. When I told Hugo and Allie, their reactions tugged at my heart. Hugo threw his arms around my waist and asked if he could come visit after school. Allie, ever practical, wanted to know how far away I'd be and if I would still help her with her reading. I told them nothing would change about how much I loved them, and they could visit as often as they liked. "We'll still have our cookie baking days," I promised Hugo, smoothing his hair, and our afternoons with books and tea. Their faces relaxed, and for the first time I felt sure I was doing the right thing, not just for me, but for them too. The move itself was simple. Muriel helped me pack my things, a few boxes of clothes, some old photographs, my favorite books, Eugene's picture for the nightstand. We made a few trips back and forth, laughing over the weight of my winter coats and the number of teacups I insisted on bringing. When it was done, I stood in my new home, looking around at the tidy rooms, the sunlight catching dust motes in the air. Muriel brought over a warm pie and a spare set of towels. She hugged me before she left her embrace strong and certain. That first night, I lay awake in the new bed, listening to the sounds of the garden outside. It was a different quiet, gentler, not empty. I opened the window and let the breeze carry in the scent of roses, and for the first time in a long while, I slept deeply. The next morning, I made coffee and took my cup outside to the small patio. The world was bright, and alive birds in the feeder Muriel waving from her porch, the distant sound of children walking to school. I spent the day arranging my books, hanging curtains, putting out Eugene's photo where I could see it every morning. Later, I walked through town with Muriel picking out new linens for the bed and a cheerful yellow teapot for the kitchen. We stopped at a cafe for blueberry muffins and sat by the window watching the world go by. There was no rush, no list of chores waiting at home, just the quiet joy of choosing for myself what to do with my time. In the days that followed, Garrett and the children came to visit, bringing flowers and hugs and a box of Hugo's favorite cookies. Garrett walked through the cottage looking at the shelves and the bright little kitchen and said it suited me. He tried once more to convince me to come home to say it wasn't too late, but I only smiled and told him that home was wherever I could be myself. He nodded, not quite understanding, but this time he didn't argue. Peyton visited on her own one afternoon, bringing a box of pastries and a new potted plant for the porch. She walked through the rooms with a careful eye, noting the lack of space, the age of the stove, the smallness of the closets. "If you need anything," she said, her tone brisk, "you know you can ask." I thanked her, poured tea, and we sat together for a few minutes, speaking quietly about the children, the weather, the coming school year. There was a distance between us that hadn't been there before, but I felt no need to fill it. As I settled into the new rhythm of my life, I found small joys in the ordinary fresh sheets on the bed, sunlight across the kitchen table, a quiet hour spent reading in the afternoon. I learned to cook for one to eat when I was hungry instead of on a schedule. I found myself humming as I swept the porch, smiling as I watched the neighbor's cat slip through the fence to nap in the garden. In the evenings, I wrote letters to old friends, called my sister in North Carolina, and sometimes joined Muriel for a walk around the block. I saw the children every week, sometimes for a few hours after school, sometimes on weekends for baking and board games. The house felt full of life during their visits, laughter echoing through the rooms, the scent of cookies warm in the air. When they left, I stood in the doorway and watched them go, grateful for every moment we shared, but glad too for the quiet that followed. Spring came soft and green, bringing longer days and gentle rain. I planted herbs on the windowsill, joined Muriel for a lecture at the library, learned the names of the neighbors who stopped to chat on their way past the garden. Little by little, I reclaimed the pieces of myself I had set aside for so many years. By the time my birthday rolled around, the cottage truly felt like home. Garrett brought the children for a small celebration, and Muriel baked a cake covered with strawberries. We sat in the garden, candles flickering in the evening breeze, and I looked around at the faces of the people who mattered most. It was a quiet happiness, the kind that comes from knowing you have chosen your own life, however late the start. As the sun slipped behind the trees, I found myself thinking that maybe, just maybe, I had finally come home. And as I watched the children chasing fireflies in the fading light, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. The days ahead were mine to shape, and for the first time in years, I felt free. The days in the cottage settled into their own gentle pattern. Each morning, I woke before sunrise, poured a cup of coffee, and stood at the window while the world outside turned soft and gold. Muriel often joined me for a walk through the neighborhood. We watched the mailman wave the early light, glinting off the dew-soaked lawns, and sometimes we'd linger by the bakery picking up a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. There was a comfort in these routines, a slow and steady unfolding of a new life that belonged only to me. Garrett and the children came by most weekends. Hugo burst through the door with stories about school and the friends he'd made, always eager for the promise of cookies or a board game at the kitchen table. Allie usually brought a book or a drawing to share, curling up in the armchair, while I listened and asked questions. The cottage filled with laughter on those days, voices bouncing off the old wood floors, the air rich with the smell of something baking, or the faint sweetness of spring flowers. When it was time for them to leave, I hugged them tight, knowing I could welcome them back whenever I chose. The first real test came a few weeks after I'd settled in. I woke one morning to find a message from Peyton, her words brisk as ever. "Garrett's out of town. I have meetings. Can you take the kids after school?" It was a simple request, one I'd answered countless times over the years, but now it came with a different feeling. I said yes, of course, and made sure there were sandwiches ready and the house was tidy. When Hugo and Allie arrived, they looked around as if seeing the cottage for the first time. "It's cozy here," Grandma Hugo said, and I smiled, watching them settle in like they belonged. We spent the afternoon just talking and sharing snacks. I listened to their stories, helped with homework, and watched as they built a fort out of cushions and blankets in the living room. When Peyton came to collect them, she looked around, taking in the neat rooms and the happy faces. She thanked me quickly, almost formally, before hurrying them out the door. For a moment, I wondered if she saw this place as a loss, a reminder of what she no longer controlled, or if she simply didn't understand why I had left. A few days later, Garrett stopped by on his own, carrying a bag of groceries and a tired smile. He sat at my kitchen table and told me about work, the way things were changing at his office, how the house felt emptier these days. He said, "We miss you, Mom." I heard the weight in his voice, but this time I didn't rush to reassure or promise to come back. Instead, I poured coffee and listened, letting him fill the space with whatever he needed to say. There was a different kind of closeness between us now, something gentler and more equal. He helped me carry a new bookshelf into the living room, and for a while, we worked side by side, the silence easy and familiar. The visits from my old house became more regular. Sometimes Hugo showed up after school with a bag of cookies he'd baked in home economics class, proud to share them with me. Allie brought drawings for the refrigerator, pictures of gardens and cats, and the cottage itself always signed "Love, Allie." Peyton would call ahead now sometimes to ask for a favor, sometimes just to check in. Our conversations were shorter, less charged than they once were. There was still a distance between us, but it was no longer so sharp or painful. Muriel and I found our own rhythm. We went to the farmer's market on Saturdays, joined a small group at the library for readings, and sometimes just sat in her kitchen sharing stories over coffee and slices of pound cake. She introduced me to friends, other women who had rebuilt their lives in small, steady ways, and for the first time in years, I felt the stir of belonging that went beyond family ties. As spring rolled into summer, the days lengthened, and the garden behind the cottage bloomed in bursts of color. I learned the names of new flowers, started keeping a journal, and let myself take slow afternoons in the sun with a book and a glass of iced tea. The world felt larger than it had in a long time, full of small, ordinary joys I had forgotten to notice. One afternoon, I was asked to give a talk at the local community college about my years as a teacher. At first, I hesitated, unsure if anyone would care to hear what I had to say, but Muriel nudged me forward. The lecture hall wasn't large, but it was filled with young faces, curious and kind. I told stories about literature and classrooms, about students who surprised me, and lessons that lingered long after the last bell. Afterwards, several students came to thank me, and I felt something in me brighten a sense of purpose I hadn't realized I'd missed. That evening, as I walked home through the gentle dusk, I thought about all the things that had changed. My life no longer fit into the neat boxes it once had, but I was learning to be comfortable with the unknown, to let days unfold without strict plans or expectations. There were still moments of loneliness, still days when I missed the old routines, but the ache had softened into something I could carry without bitterness. Garrett called one night, his voice hesitant but hopeful. He asked if I'd come by the old house for Sunday dinner. "The kids keep asking, and it would mean a lot to us," he said. I agreed, feeling a calm settle over me. When I walked through the front door that Sunday, the house looked different, less like the place I'd built with Eugene, more like a home that belonged to someone else. We sat around the table, sharing stories and laughter, and for the first time, I felt like a guest, not a caretaker. After dinner, as the sun dipped low and the children ran outside to catch fireflies, Garrett lingered at the table. He reached for my hand, his voice steady. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said. I didn't understand at first, but I do now. I squeezed his hand, the quiet between us filled with understanding. As I walked home in the fading light, I listened to the cicadas singing in the trees and the soft wind moving through the leaves. The cottage lights glowed ahead, a beacon in the dusk. I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, and stood for a moment in the stillness, grateful for how far I'd come. There was still more to discover, new joys to be found, old wounds to be mended. I knew the journey wasn't finished, but for the first time I was truly looking forward to what lay ahead. A gentle breeze moved through the garden as I sat with Muriel under the shade of her maple tree, the afternoon sun slanting low across the patio. The scent of fresh earth and new blossoms carried on the air, mingling with the distant laughter of children finishing their day at school. In that stillness, I let myself breathe, feeling the weight of the past few months lift just a little more with every quiet moment. For the first time in years, I could feel something settle in me, a sense of belonging that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. It was in those days of new routines and small freedoms that my old house began to feel truly distant, less like the center of my life and more like a place I had once passed through. Still, the threads of family remained. Garrett and the children continued to visit sometimes with grocery bags or a bouquet of daffodils, sometimes just with their bright chatter and arms eager for hugs. Our visits grew more relaxed. Hugo spent long afternoons curled up with his favorite adventure stories, asking me to read just one more chapter. Allie brought her notebooks and told me about her school projects, her quiet pride in each new achievement lighting up her eyes. The changes between me and my son came slowly but surely. Garrett made it a point to call every few days, checking in, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to know how I was. Our conversations became easier. We laughed more often, even as we worked through memories that used to bring only sadness. He came alone one afternoon and found me tending my potted herbs. "Mind if I sit with you?" he asked, lowering himself onto the bench beside me. We sat side by side, hands quiet in our laps, while the world around us hummed with the easy sounds of summer. After a while, Garrett spoke. "Mom, I want to apologize for real. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I ever understood what you needed from us." His words were careful, not hurried. "I'm sorry for how we treated you, taking for granted all the ways you held everything together. I let Peyton's worries and my own blind spots cloud what really mattered. I listened, not interrupting, letting his apology settle between us. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. When I finally answered, I simply told him that forgiveness isn't always quick, but that I heard him and believed he meant it. That conversation seemed to shift something between us. Garrett began to visit more, just for the sake of visiting, not out of guilt or routine. We talked about books and music, sometimes about Eugene and the early years before all the noise and the schedules. There were quiet moments too, times when neither of us said much, but the air felt full and good. The past had not vanished, but it didn't weigh so heavy. Peyton too began to change in small, deliberate ways. She brought the children by after school, stayed for tea, and sometimes lingered to ask about my garden or the lectures I had started giving at the college. There was still a kind of formal politeness between us, a carefulness in the way she moved through the cottage and complimented my latest batch of cookies. But the old edge was gone. Once she left a thank you note on the kitchen table in her tidy handwriting. I kept it in a drawer, not for the words themselves, but for the simple fact that she had written it. Life outside the family quietly blossomed. Muriel's circle of friends welcomed me in, with easy laughter and warm conversation. We went to the library together, tried out new recipes, and shared stories from our teaching days. The little guest cottage became a place for gatherings, afternoon book clubs, game nights, even a small birthday party for Allie. The walls filled with the soft chaos of living photos, children's drawings, a scatter of well-read paperbacks. It was in the middle of one of those gatherings, with laughter floating from the kitchen and the sweet smell of apple pie in the air, that I realized I had stopped waiting for life to return to what it once was. Instead, I had let it open up to something entirely new, unfamiliar, at times, sometimes lonely, but full of possibility. When I found myself invited to speak at the college about my teaching years, I accepted, nerves and all. The young faces in the lecture hall listened, asked questions, and afterwards a few even came up to thank me. Their respect gave me a quiet confidence I hadn't felt since Eugene was alive. The children flourished with this new arrangement. Hugo and Allie loved the little rituals we created, our reading afternoons, our weekend walks to the bakery, the way I let them help in the kitchen without worrying about the mess. Garrett started dropping them off more often sometimes, just so they could be with me while he and Peyton handled work or errands. There was never any talk of me moving back. Instead, our family shaped itself around the new reality. One evening, as dusk fell and the first fireflies danced above the garden, Garrett stayed behind after the children left with Peyton. We sat on the porch steps, looking out over the yard. He told me about a memory from when he was a child, how I always had a light on for him, how he never doubted he could come home. "I hope you feel that now, Mom," he said quietly. "I hope you know you can call us anytime for anything." I squeezed his hand and assured him I did. As summer drifted toward fall, I found myself looking forward to each new day. There were still hard moments, old habits tugging at me, worries about the future, but I had learned to trust my own strength and to lean on the people who truly cared. My cottage was small, but it held everything I needed. My life was not perfect, but it was finally mine. I couldn't have known then what the next season would bring. But as the days grew shorter and the air turned crisp, I felt a deep sense of peace settle in. The hardest part was behind me. What remained was the promise of something lasting and real, a family rebuilt not by duty, but by choice, and a life shaped by quiet courage. The path ahead was my own to walk, and for the first time, I welcomed it. The years slipped by gentle and steady, like the river that ran behind Muriel's garden. Each season brought its own small joys, sunlight slanting through the kitchen window. Hugo's growing voice calling out across the lawn. Allie's neat handwriting in a birthday card slipped beneath my door. There were days when the old ache still flickered up, moments when I remembered the sting of feeling invisible in my own home. But they faded against the life I had found for myself. The cottage had become more than just a roof and walls. It was a quiet testament to the idea that starting over isn't only for the young. My relationship with Garrett found its footing in something new, something gentler and more equal. He came by most Sunday afternoons, often with a pie or a bouquet from the market, sitting with me in the shade and sharing bits of his life I'd never thought I'd hear. Peyton, in her way, softened too. She never apologized with big words or gestures, but over time, her sharpness wore away. She asked for advice with the children, trusted me with small confidences, and sometimes on rare evenings stayed to share a pot of tea at my table. The children grew up faster than I was ready for, but each stage brought a new rhythm to our lives. Hugo became tall and lanky, with a thoughtful, patient nature. Allie, always quick-witted, filled her sketchbooks with scenes from the garden and stories from her imagination. They visited often, helping in the kitchen, curling up with books, filling my little house with laughter and life. They always found their way back, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. That was what mattered most to me. Looking back, I realize I never wanted revenge, only respect, a place to belong, a voice that was heard. I learned late, but not too late, that dignity isn't something given by others. It's something you quietly claim for yourself, one small choice at a time. My world did not become grand or perfect, but it became honest. I discovered the strength that comes from letting go of what hurts you, and the joy that comes from building something new, even at 79. Sometimes I still catch myself waiting for a familiar footstep on the porch, or a voice calling from another room. But now, when I feel that longing, I remember all that has changed, not just for me, but for everyone I love. My life is still full, just in ways I could never have imagined when I first stood on my own. I am not just someone's mother or grandmother or helper. I am Beverly, and my story is my own. If there's a lesson to share, it's this. You are never too old to draw a line, to claim a bit of light for yourself, or to start again. No matter how many years you've lived in someone else's shadow, there is always a day you can choose to step forward. And sometimes that day is the beginning of everything. Thank you for listening to my story. If any part of it made you think of your own journey, I hope you'll share it below, or simply carry it with you wherever you're heading next. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome to join me again.